Welcome back and thanks for staying with Africa News Network First Fast Live. My name is Cindy Mabi. Good evening to you. NN7's IFMS Exposé resounded in Parliament and exposed the cracks in National Treasury's Financial Management Systems project. Today we bring you another big exposé that once again shows the fault lines in how Treasury handles public funds. And we tell you how a grand project to save on government expenditure ended up with even more wasteful and fruitless expenditure. NN7 has accessed another draft audit report of National Treasury that is gathering dust for lack of action. It exposes how a company contracted to help save procurement expenditure on the government's top 100 suppliers ended up with 25 million rand for incompetence, and it's a sorry state of financial mismanagement and a possible corruption. Take a look. This is National Treasury's savings debacle.
The Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in the National Treasury, the nerve center of the annual multi-billion rand purchases for the national and provincial government departments. In his 2016 budget speech, then Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan announces an ambitious scheme to save on costs. The Office of the Chief Procurement Officer mandated to review government contracts to cap government expenditure.
The Central Procurement Officer's mandate is to achieve savings of 25 billion rands a year by the third year of the current MTF period, out of the government procurement budget of about 500 billion rands a year. Our reform proposals draw on a consultation program last year that reached over 7,000 suppliers, 2,500 supply chain practitioners, and attracted over 27,000 responses to a national survey.
Meanwhile, his men in the National Treasury had already set the ball rolling. It's October 2015. Skalk Yiman is the Chief Director for Supply Chain Management for ICT in the National Treasury. His then boss, Treasury's Chief Procurement Officer Kenneth Brown, initiates a plan to realize Gordhan's grand ambitions. The duo zoom in on the government's top 100 suppliers. Just in the last 3 financial years, the government has spent a whopping 53 billion on procurement from these 100 suppliers. What stands out in these contracts are the gross discrepancies. Cost variations are high. Different national and provincial governments are charged inconsistently for the same item by the same company. Kenneth Brown and Skalk Yiman get permission from the then DG Lungisa Fuzile to deviate from the competitive bidding process to hire a contract negotiator with the government's top 100 suppliers. The Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supplies, or CIPS, is handpicked by the two to renegotiate with the government's top 100 suppliers at a cost of 25 million rand. But the ambitious plan, when implemented, comes up in tatters. Over the next 13 months, Treasury doles out taxpayers' money to CIPS every month at the rate of almost 2 million rand a month, not bothering to check on project deliverables or aligning the billing to deliverables, paying millions for unproved work and for hours billed to unknown consultants. Ironically, it is the National Treasury's own draft audit report in November 2016 that blows the whistle on the gross irregularities in Kenneth Brown's and Skalk Yiman's pet project. CIPS did work on only 22 of the top 100 suppliers. 78 contracts never reviewed, negotiated, or renegotiated. Payment of invoices not aligned to project deliverables. Poor project management by Office of the CPO. All that the CIPS project has to show for its work is revised MOUs and procurement agreements with 4 hotels, 2 airlines, namely SAA and Comair, 1 Microsoft service agreement, and a revised agreement with Telkom. Given the gaps in work done, the draft internal audit recommends that National Treasury recovers some 19.5 million rand from CIPS. But the draft audit report hits a massive roadblock. In December 2016, then Chief Procurement Officer Kenneth Brown leaves the Treasury under a cloud, with the Hawks investigating corruption allegations against him. The man believed to be his protege, Skalk Himan, is elevated as the acting Chief Procurement Officer. The internal Treasury report on the utter mismanagement and the alleged corruption in the 25 million rand CIPS project is buried. Sources on the OCPO are convinced that Skalk Himan will never allow the draft report to be made public or acted upon, given his personal involvement in the financial mess that the 100 Suppliers project has eventually become. As we speak now, the damning draft audit report continues to gather dust in the corridors of the National's top financial institution, which manages the public purse. A tale of gross irregularities, wasteful expenditure, and possible corruption buried.
And we cut across to my colleague Gio Rapedzi to take us through some of the key highlights of the damning draft audit report, which has not seen the light of day since it was completed in November last year.
Thank you. Well, let's just take a look at some of the highlights of this damning draft report. While the contract scope was changed without a following due process, the CIPS only did work on only 22 suppliers and not the top 100 suppliers. 78 suppliers' contracts were never reviewed, negotiated or renegotiated. Only the travel, flights and accommodation, construction and telecommunications and ICT companies' contracts were looked into. The full amount of 25 million rands was paid to CIPS despite the contract scope not being met. The next point is that the invoice payments were not justified. The Office of the Chief Procurement Officer approved and paid monthly CIPS invoices of an average of 1.9 million rands per month. The invoices submitted were not aligned to the project deliverables as per the service level agreement with the CIPS. Well, the monthly progress reports submitted do not align with the service level agreements with the CIPS. The invoices submitted do not indicate the total hours billed per month, the deliverables or activities for the month, or the hourly rate per consultant. There was no project plan developed with the costing aligned to each deliverable. Now looking at the poor project management by the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, the change of contract scope without following the correct supply chain management processes resulted in work done only for 22 and not the top 100 suppliers. The CIPS invoiced the National Treasury for the work not approved, work they were not contracted to do, and work that was done by unknown consultants. The project weaknesses resulted in the CIPS issuing a credit note to the value of 2.5 million rands to the department. Deliverables by the CIPS were not fully analysed to assess whether they met expected service standards and quality. It's back to you.
And more than one source within National Treasury says no one expects the draft audit report on CIPS to resurface. After all, why would Acting Chief Procurement Officer Skalk Human act against the report that indicts a project that he himself authored? Just for the record, ANN7 has written to both National Treasury and CIPS Africa asking them key questions pertaining to these irregularities. And while we're yet to receive a response from National Treasury, CIPS Africa has sent an email response to our queries. They say, and I quote, in December 2015, CIPS was approached to support the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer at National Treasury of South Africa, and this contract was concluded in November 2016 when the project was accepted as complete by the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer on behalf of National Treasury, and the work was centered on achieving better value for money in government contracts. CIPS delivered on all its contractual duties and obligations as required by National Treasury, and as is usual in supplier-client relationships, the details are confidential, and the last bit says, please direct any further questions to National Treasury, end quote. And we welcome back Cecilia Russell as ANN7 Special Projects Editor and Zamo Madlala, spokesperson for the Black Empowerment Foundation, Adil Nchabeling, Transform RSA President, and we have Carl Niehaus, who is here as a political analyst, and we still have Ahmed Sheikh Imam, the National Freedom Party Member of Parliament on our outside broadcast facility. Again, welcome back and thanks so much for joining us. Give us the context. It seems to be quite a lot of moving targets, Cecilia, but you were intricately involved in the investigation. Where does this now bring us, the top 100 suppliers being investigated? What was the objective of it all?
Well, you must understand the context in which this project started. The economy was contracting, things were not looking good. There was increasing unemployment, so there was revenues, and the fiscus was really stretched, and so this was an ambitious project to try and bring good value to government in terms of procurement. They decided to start with the top 100. People that government does business with, and so it's yet again, I suppose, another dismal failure because, an ambitious project kind of died. Lots of money, 25 million, you've heard, went down the drain. Only 22 1/5 of the numbers were able to were successfully renegotiated, and so and on top of it, there's another internal audit report which is sitting there gathering dust.
Okay, so this is separate from the integrated financial management process that was supposed to sort of have a desktop approach to government spending in various departments. This one to investigate whether the processes were followed with the top 100 suppliers of National Treasury. Would you say a good idea but badly executed, Zamo?
Well, Cindy, let's start here. The whole Office of the Chief Procurement Officer was set to try and bring about efficiency. Now, you bring about efficiency by following this very same due process that you account by. And when you actually start looking into it, if you just look at the moving pieces, Kenneth Brown is now no longer there, he's working somewhere in the private sector, companies not to be mentioned. He's moved out. Now, when you were reading that, it was said that the whole contracts were set to achieve better value for whom? It didn't say better value for government if you go back and you look at your actual wording. So perhaps it was maybe let's work out a bit of a 10% for me. It's an allegation on my part, I don't know. I don't know. This is what Scopa may have to sit now and get into the details. The same draft report that we now sit in front of ourselves with now needs to stop gathering dust, and Scopa needs to start. And I believe they're best placed to start asking the detailed question that what were the savings on travel? What were the savings on all of these contracts that were renegotiated, and why only the 22 were approached and not the 400? Why was the entire amount paid for the project if they only did a fifth of the work?
Yeah. Your response from what the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supplies wrote back to us with the questions around their responsibility in ensuring that there isn't an embellishment or overinflation of prices, and especially with these 100 top companies that supply Treasury. Your reaction, Adil, in that they seem to believe contractually they're okay, they're not liable in any way, the work was done and delivered.
Then why, if they are not liable, why did they return back a credit note to government? Credit note meaning I have over-invoiced you, so I'm actually giving you a credit to say whatever I have made you overpay, you don't have to pay anymore, because now on my invoices, the future invoices, I'm going to deduct against that. So it doesn't make sense if you are not in a wrongdoing and then you issue out a credit note worth over 2 million plus. With regards to government, it's the first I've had in my life, by the way. PFMA, I don't know if it has a credit note option or even a clause in it. It's something that we'll have to actually look into it. But again, it just tells you that CIPS, with regards to the way it was conducting its own work, they were doing something which it was well intended, which is the IRP process, which is the integrated risk management process of looking at thoroughly as to where they can make savings. But since we know that the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, who left the job when there was a major allegation against him, being actually pointed as the man who used to receive brown envelopes, all right, and was actually known to be depositing huge chunks amounts of money, left his job and left Treasury under a huge suspicious cloud. All right, so one must ask as to what was really happening within Treasury. And we have now uncovered that there's been a lot of discount passing through. But that discount was not coming back to the taxpayer's pocket. It was going back into various people's pockets and was used as a cash reserves and cash sources. In this case, Mr. Brown, known as the Mr. Brown envelope, has been the one particularly picking up the money and using it for whatever other sources of revenues that they were using it for, but not for public sake and actually to save government money. And in this case, we need to get into the intricacies of what really was the whole project exercise all about. They wanted to save government money. In what areas? Transportation, ICT, all of the procurement services that government buys, which are quite critical to the running and efficient operation of government. But as a result, that money in terms of the suppliers, here we're talking about they were supposed to negotiate with banks, they were supposed to negotiate with transport companies, construction companies, they were supposed to negotiate with suppliers of various goods and services out of the 100 basket of suppliers, right? And 27 categories of supplied services to government. And in that whole process, they could not even recover as much as 25 million. It tells you a bit of a story.
Mr. Ahmed Sheikh Imam, NFP Member of Parliament, thanks again for joining us. You're talking about the various committees, oversight committees within government. How then do you explain the second phase of irregularities and the draft report that is collecting dust in Treasury that is supposed to have streamlined and have more efficiency with government spent? And now we hear, that there were irregularities that were unattended to.
Well, let me start off by saying that, in the budget processes that we have before the budgets are approved, we go through a process where we interrogate previous reports, we interrogate the budget, we interrogate the strategic plans that come forward. And I must admit that, even from the Appropriation Committee point of view, we have never heard before until ANN7 did this expose and released this information. We were not aware that there was a problem with the IFMS project at all. So the question is, why did Treasury not release that information to us and tell us what was going on and what the problems that they were experiencing in terms of the project? So I'm not, surprised at what we're hearing now. This might just be the tip of the iceberg. There must be a hell of a lot that is going on in Treasury, which we will have to now uncover from time to time. Because like I've said previously, the understanding was that Treasury was a cut above the rest. They knew what they were doing. They were in control. They've always had allegations against every other department. But here you can see it's the other way around. And, I think my colleagues there are correct. When somebody gives you a credit note, how did you pay that person in the first place? Surely you pay on work done. And your chief procurement officer who came to us and did presentations and told us how perfect the system is, how they were going to save billions and rand for taxpayers and divert that money into service delivery. What has happened? In a cloud of dust, suddenly you find that he leaves, you find the DG decides to leave, and the question is why? Isn't that opportune timing for them to leave? So the question that arises is the internal processes, we have the internal audit system, is it sufficient, is it adequate? Clearly it is not.
All right, Mr. Amim, just stay on the line. Now, we also take a look now at the key project deliverables that were not achieved in this project to cut costs in the government's top 100 suppliers, and why the draft internal audit recommended that 19.5 million rand be recovered from CIPS Africa.
Take a look at those key deliverables. Well, CIPS only reviewed a contract and service level agreements, etc., for 22 out of the 100 service providers. The recommendation from the draft report was to recover the costs in proportion to delivery. The market comparison of goods and services, price and quality of contracting was only done for selected sectors. The recommendation was to recover the costs in proportion to the delivery. The negotiation strategy developed for 22 suppliers and not the top 100 suppliers. The recommendation here was to recover the cost in proportion to delivery. There was no trend analysis report developed per commodity per contract. The recommendation here was to recover the cost in proportion to delivery. The CIPS did not provide the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer with the integrated risk management approach. The recommendation here was to recover the costs for non-delivery. Or support to the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in leading negotiations with customers, suppliers and strategic business partners was not done for all top 100 suppliers. The recommendation here was to recover costs in proportion to delivery. And lastly, there was no skills transfer and knowledge provided to the seconded government employees as per the contract. The recommendation was to recover the costs in proportion to delivery. It's back to you.
And joining us in studio is Mnyamezeli Shedrack Boy, a member of Parliament, the ANC MP, and Colney House political analyst. Just again, we go back to if our policymakers and the custodians of law and order, not only in government but in society general, Mr. Boy, are able to get away with what this draft report implicates Treasury to have done, and we do emphasize that it's a draft report, sitting over 12 months, nothing being done, what is the role of MPs then if they can't safeguard taxpayers' money and be held accountable?
Now, I thought that, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for allowing me to come. You see, this is what we're trying to deal with today, the behavior of Treasury, when Treasury in itself antagonizes the Auditor General, because any other finances and accounting is supposed to be done by the Auditor General and then report to Parliament, so that you don't rely on leaks, but you get an official statement from them. Now, Treasury throughout all its years, up until today, has been reluctant to account to Parliament. That's the reality. And we have said it openly to them. We have been engaging the different DGs and appealing to them that the fact that in the last one, the one that we had to get into the IFMS itself, we had to come through in an antagonist, in a fight between themselves and Treasury and the Auditor General. Then the information came to our side. It's while you were running it in media. We then became aware that there is a problem. And then when we were explaining to the ministry today that this is what has been happening, you might not have been. The project of IFMS have started in 2005. This is 2017. Nothing has been delivered. That's the behavior of Treasury. And that's why we're saying today that it's a problem when Treasury in itself don't seem to want to be accountable to all the other structures created by the Constitution.
But so, where does that character or nature, systemic approach of Treasury necessarily being autonomous and not being accountable to Parliament or government in general?
Let's not call it autonomous, because if it's autonomous, it means the constitutional arrangement. Let's call it a little bit... I'm
saying in their demeanor, as you were saying.
Let's call it arrogance.
All right.
I'll
go with arrogance.
Don't use words that are going to make it if it's a standing rule. It's not a rule. I mean, you have got 4 ministers since 1994. This is what has happened, and nothing was done. You've had 2 presidents presiding over this administration, both President Beg and both President Zuma. Nothing has been done. And IFMS is so much crucial because it meant that in terms of what we wanted to achieve is when you made a unitary state, you see that thing, and that's what it is. What I'm just showing is like there is a background to the problems that are now beheading or attacking Treasury itself. Because
and what's your view on the draft report that is in our possession of the 100 top suppliers of Treasury that were meant to have been either renegotiated, reevaluated to streamline the finances of the National Treasury?
Well, the ministry have made him aware, Minister Gikaba, that there is challenges in your department. But there's a history to those problems. Because he came not from a long reshuffle that has taken place, but it's the first one that at least Treasury would have come to openness where we are able to engage. But for years, Treasury has been hiding, and it's been very difficult, even to parliamentarians, to know what is going on there. We have known about this thing of IFMS in 2005. We asked it in 2015 when we arrived in Parliament. They haven't been able to open up. So Treasury in itself, that's why I was saying that Treasury and the work that we are doing in exposing them is a problem in itself as an institution.
Yeah. Mr. Carl Niehaus, you think this is a Pandora's box that we've uncovered here, that there might be more?
Well, you see, if we go back to what we saw with the IFMS report and the rot that was there, and we compare that to what is happening here, one gets an overall impression that Treasury was not exerted control over what was happening and how the finances of our people and our taxes are being spent. So ultimately, you have asked the question several times on the screens also here, who should be kept responsible? Obviously, at the end of the day, a fish rots from the head. And the minister who was in charge has to be kept responsible together with the senior officials. Now, we are seeing from the IFMS report, now also the CIPS not doing its job, not actually checking 100 companies but only 22, not going through the proper auditing processes, therefore not saving the money that it was intended to do. What we see here is that the former Minister of Finance, Minister Pravin Gordhan, or former Minister Pravin Gordhan, who has tried to set himself up as a paragon of good governance, as a paragon of ethical governance, has failed dismally. And at the end of the day, we have to say he has to be kept responsible. Unfortunately, former Minister Gordhan is now becoming a severe embarrassment for the African National Congress. He has tried to cast shade and shadow on other people, while the largest shadow is actually falling on him. And this report is just another indication of his failure to actually implement good governance.
Let's get a view from Mr. Sheikh Imam, your view, and not only holding Pravin Gordhan responsible, I suppose his predecessors as well, but him as the most immediate former finance minister. Do you think that there is now a clout around what his work or tenure was at Treasury?
Well, let me start off by, I must agree with my colleague, the Honorable Boy, when he says that it was arrogance of Treasury. And like I said earlier on, Treasury have always believed they were cut above the rest. They were in control and they did as and what they wanted to do. But clearly, what is, I think, evident now is that there've been mismanagement. Well, whether it's mismanagement or it was not managed at all, that is where the difference is. But I think what is very, very important and what we need to do now is maybe we need to call for a commission of inquiry into the affairs of Treasury, because if this is what you have uncovered as the media and we as members of parliament with all the different structures that we have in government, if we are not able to pick it up and it goes to you, so clearly there is something wrong. So we need to start there first of all and maybe call for an inquiry, a commission of inquiry to look into the issues of Treasury and even specifically into these issues as to how much of money was saved. What was the mandate? What did they do? How did they pay? Who paid? Who was responsible? How is it that they went to the extent of paying and even getting a credit note? So clearly it's a violation violated all the principles of the supply chain management rules. That is basically what has happened. But the question that also arises is, what was the real intention of Treasury? Because we talk about radical economic transformation. Clearly, for the last decade, if you really look at it, there was no radical economic transformation in terms of the policies and what Treasury has promoted. You know, all what we find is this, that the wealth of this country is still in the hands of a few. If you see what it is doing, is still favoring certain white monopoly capitalists in the country, and it really has not benefited the poorest of the poor or the up-and-coming businesses. So the policies that were also promoted by these ministers and the departments must also be looked into. So I think there's a very much bigger picture that we need to look at it. And I think a commission might be able to uncover all these things for us.
And just on the part of former finance minister, you think it may be a good idea to institute austerity measures that was badly executed? Or do you think that he should have had an oversight role in ensuring that the service provider, in this case, Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supplies, abides to their obligation of fulfilling the role of scrutinizing the 100 suppliers to Treasury?
Well, absolutely. Otherwise, why do we need a finance minister? Why do we need somebody in charge? Why do we need management? If they don't have control over the departments and not able to oversee and ensure that they entered into a contract, but no one, absolutely no one in that department has ensured that those the CPIs has complied in terms of that they've provided. I mean, they have actually gone on to pay people and get a credit note, like my colleague is saying. They got a credit note, which means. And now that you found that the audit report says it, why would the audit report now call for 19.5 million to be paid back? Clearly, the work was not done. And I think the minister, together with his DG, they must all take responsibility. And it goes back to the other thing. Why? Why did the DG leave? Why did the former the DG leave, first of all, and the chief procurement officer, of course? Why did he decide to leave on a cloud of... And let me tell you, when he did appear before us, he gave us the assurance everything was fine. He was going to do this. He was going to save us 200 and somewhat billion, like I said earlier on. But a week later, this is all what we find out. So the question that arises, and I must agree, you're not going to get this information until that information is forced out of them. Because when it came to the integrated financial management system, and when you released a lot of information on ANN 7, we met with Treasury. Treasury, when we interviewed them, and we interviewed them right till 20 past 8 until we were fed up of them, and we told them to go and come back when you can give us and release us all the information that we need. To date, nothing has come back. So they're not going to give you this information until we deal with them and take the necessary steps. But I want to add, as long as there's no consequences, and clearly in government today there is no consequences. We go on oversights, we uncover a hell of a lot, but nothing happens, and that's why it goes on and on and on. So it's a waste of taxpayers' money, even going on oversight visits, because you uncover these things, you come back, you report, and nothing happens. Right now, Scopa has picked up a whole lot of things. You've released a lot of information. The question is, where does it go from here? It's not going to go anywhere unless we are serious about ensuring that people account. And I think the minister, together with the department, even those that have left just now, must be held accountable. And if necessary, criminal charges must also be pursued against them.
All right.
In the interest of our country.
Please stay on the line, Mr. Imam. Your response in terms of who should be held to account.
Yes, I think that he's right. You know, those people, you know, the ministers, the DGs, etc., need to be held to account. But I think one of the most interesting things that emerged from the meeting this morning on the IFMS in Scopa is the fact that the Auditor General, after this expose of ours, has picked up that there are these irregularities. For the first time, and so there's a danger that they may get a qualified report. Now that is really, really very scary, because the Treasury has been able to sort of put out this image that they're absolutely perfect in every way, and the very institutions that should be holding them to account are clearly not holding them to account, but now have to. So I think that there's great hope in a way, because I think that their finances are going to be scrutinized very, very carefully.
Yeah, and Mr. Boy, I mean, if you look at gross discrepancies that this draft audit report has revealed, cost variations depending on which government department is being serviced for the same item, work not being completed. We're talking about issues like time management and timesheets. What do you make out of it? If this is only the first that we've had of it, and your relationship or tumultuous relationship with a Treasury, as you were saying, that there could be more.
Quite clearly, there's a lot that has happened in Treasury that has not been exposed at this particular moment. You see, when they did the centralized procurement under the gentleman who was doing procurement, it became very clear that the people are going to benefit, because a lot of small businesses and those that are BEE started to fall out of line and became very angry about government, that government is taking away their food. And ordinarily, when you go around as a member of parliament around Sandton, they raise this issue, that Kenny Brown have now decided with this centralization and to disempower the majority of our people. And this is where we're pursuing. That there's going to be consequences, yes. In Scopa, where I sit quite regularly, we've dragged in the Hawks, we've dragged in the NPA under the anti-corruption unit, because we want to be very clear and specific that you take the money of the taxpayers, somebody must account. And we have said it to Treasury, that we are not here to come and be engaging you on dilly-dally with you. We know that there's a deep problem, because if they had implemented the IFMS, we wouldn't have been talking about corruption today in government. It's a centralized structure, and now we tested with this, with Kenny Brown and procurement, and these are the consequences.
Yeah. Cecilia, would you say this is an extension of internal audits, but to separate it with the integrated financial services and the top 100 suppliers? How do the two interlink if there is such a bridge?
Well, they. One of the big projects is to try and centralize the procurement database, so that there are all sorts of very odd things that happen. For example, the same supplier will charge a province differently from national government, and all these kinds of things. So you get rid of all of those different problems. At the same time, this was the separate project. It was a cost-saving project, an important cost-saving project. You know, a procurement in what's the 500 billion, or is massive amount of money that gets spent in government. And so procurement is like really the center of what happens to everybody's taxpayers' money. So these two projects, they were running probably alongside each other and coinciding with each other.
All right, let's just get other details. If you've just joined us, looking at the latest draft audit report that ANN7 has in its possession, which has been gathering dust for the last 9 months, and sources within Treasury tell us that they do not expect it to be finalized or made public, and even given that the flawed project has the signature of Acting Chief Procurement Officer Skal Kuman, and given that my colleague Kiorapetsi takes us through more on what actually is going on there.
Thank you. Looking at who must act, the first on the list is Dondo Mokgajane, the Treasury Director General. Next up is Malusi Gigaba, the Finance Minister. We also have Eunice Karin, the Chairperson of the Standing Committee of Finance. Also on the list is Temba Godi, the Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. It's back to you.
Thank you so much. And we're going to take this to Mr. Boy. I think what we want to have is for government or parliament to take the viewers and South Africans into your confidence that something will be done. We've heard from our sources that they're concerned that very little any action will be taken.
Yes, all of us has been skeptical over some time of how government processes work. And quite clearly, we have engaged the Hawks under the anti-corruption unit, because we want them to take action. Parliament can't take action. What Parliament is doing is equally listening to your reporter to expose, and then you ask the Auditor General to provide us with the evidence, and after that, we direct the Hawks in engaging them and telling them that this is what is happening. And today they were telling us they were very happy in how we have been exposing some of the things that have been happening. Quite clearly, already there's part of the documentation that are related to IFMS is in front of their desk, and they're beginning to look into it.
And Mr. Niehaus, or maybe Adil, the implications that the 53 billion rand procurement that's been spent over the 100 preferred suppliers within Treasury, we don't even know what the Black Economic Empowerment spent is primarily on these particular companies. Then we have a system that is trying to clean up, to expose if there's any irregularities, and we end up with a 25 million rand bill for very little work done.
The 53 billion rand which was actually spent is very interesting. If you calculate the amount of money which each individual company in that 100 top category was making, is about 530 million per company per year. And these companies were making this amount of money on a lifetime contract, by the way. Their contracts were evergreen and always renewable without having to go to tender. These are suppliers for hotel services, suppliers for ICT services, suppliers for transportation services, construction and all other related government services and everything. So companies in South Africa who were really not even compliant, most of them, because they didn't need to. The government did not compel them for any of that reason. You're looking at hotel companies, which most of them are not BE compliant. You're looking at ICT companies, which most of them are not BE compliant. But the real issue is, how does our government, over the last many years of being in power, keep on taking the same amount of money? If you're paying a company 530 million every year without failure, and you do not even ask yourself what value are we deriving from these companies, and how is that value coming back to growing your own objectives as a government? One, radical economic transformation. Then it was part of the reconstruction and development plan, when we used to hear the beautiful, melodious, sort of poetic budget speeches from Trevor Manuel speeches. In this case, he is one of the people who have actually created the whole precedence of what happened within Treasury. Why today is he not actually being brought into the fore and being made as one of the examples of people who gave us poetic lyrics of budgets, whereas in the midst of it there was a mess? So 530 million was spent on each and every company. And yet we have nothing, very little, as a dividend to the people of South Africa. We are sitting here as black companies who are complaining that government has never taken care of us. They have never grown the aspect of radical economic transformation, BEE part of it, which we don't really care anymore. We don't need to be part of white companies to ever make a difference. But the issue is, why were black companies never prioritized and given the opportunity to benefit out of the 550 million?
Let's look at who's now currently running the Chief of Procurement Office within National Treasury, and being Mr. Skalk Human, who was in the center of this Chartered Institute of Procurement Suppliers project to also streamline the finances within Treasury. He's now in charge there. Shouldn't there be an assessment, based on your previous performance? Therefore, you can then ascend to your next progression in your career. How does it work? Mr. Boy.
No, quite clearly, Treasury has to take a step back. I mean, we have clearly indicated to the minister that you need to be able to know who is next to you, see, because you can't have a staff that seems to know more than you and never go back to you. Because when we are asking questions and we're directing those questions to the Auditor General in terms of what the PFMA expect, we could see that even he himself, the DG, didn't understand what is going on in the department. And that became the same question, that what is it that you're going to do? Because if you lock yourself up into the room, which he is correct, that the problems in Treasury, because they doesn't want transparency, have been running on for a very long time. 4 ministers that have been in that particular department, and nothing has been able to be put on the table so that you could be able to see how South Africans are benefiting in the nature of projects and where our money is being spent. But we are taking action on it.
Very briefly, Zamo, just in the project leaders now, or whether that they themselves need to be under public scrutiny in how they spend public funds.
Okay, I think firstly, just to speak to the general man in the street, the project that was brought in to come and save Treasury money from procurement, one of their subcontractors was charging 9,600 Rand per hour. I'm just telling the normal man in the street now. one of the companies that was subcontracted to come and assist in saving money charged 9,600 per hour. Very grateful that Mr. Boy is here, part of the panel, and I congratulate him on his toughness, especially in his questioning. So obviously a lot of questions need to be asked. But obviously it then appears that the entire project was about, we want to centralize, and it goes back to the triple PFA, and triple PFA says 90-10 pricing for contracts over this amount, and therefore, in a way, you are always totally excluding your smaller players. And once the bigger players get in, because they don't have to account, they then start creating their imaginary, fictionary invoices that end up being so great. But then reports get written up, and then they'll go, and then they'll be stashed under somebody's desk for years and years to come until come an ANN7 or whoever to expose it.
Yeah, but who's best to deal with the irregularities, and especially where we've highlighted 2 failed projects so far?
In terms of trust, right now, I'd put trust in Scopa, and Mr. Boy is right here, right now. I would leave it with him that at the next round, he must ask the proper questions.
Mr. Niehaus.
Yeah.
Well, you see, I've been a member of parliament, so I understand that these parliamentary committees have an oversight function and they have to investigate what's going on. But ultimately, the buck is going to have to stop with the Minister of Finance. And I really believe the time had come that the Minister of Finance now has to take strong and the necessary action. If we go through this report, I think there is the possibility that there has been criminal action and fraud. The Minister has to appoint a proper investigation into these matters. And the people who have been responsible, if we read through this report, it is one omission after the other. And I don't believe it is simply just omissions because people were incapable of doing their jobs. I believe it was done deliberately. And it was done deliberately because there were certain parties that were benefiting from this process. Why is it that there were only 22 companies that were concentrated on out of 100? Why is it when we analyze this that primarily black empowerment companies are left out? It is probably criminal, but beyond that, it is a shame that a government that is dedicated to radical economic transformation, since we passed a resolution in Mangaung already in 2012, had a Minister of Finance that was not pushing for the right implementation of these projects and for black economic empowerment. And Minister Gigaba now has to take the necessary action. And that action has to include also checking on the behavior of his previous colleague, the previous Minister of Finance, and if there is the necessary criminal charges that has to be brought, it must be brought without fear and without favor.
Just your view. I mean, we're back on to, there's been so many other finance ministers, and getting to the bottom, there seems to be a culture of impunity in government, as Sheikh Imam was saying, that who then would take the rap? Does it lie squarely with the finance minister? And does Scopa have the authority to summon or, call in those that are implicated?
No, those that are implicated, where I'm seated, from what we have reflected on today, they are coming back to Parliament and account. We just don't want to account because we have got the evidence. We know what has happened. You have helped us, and the internal audit have exposed them. At least the one thing that the minister did today was to dismiss Deloitte and Touch. Because Deloitte and Touch, that huge company, in itself, even went to the minister and says, I'll do this work for you of IFMS, but you must please give me another work. Now, how is that type of morality? Then he said to Parliament, he has dismissed them and has reported them to the bodies that are necessary about accounting. So that's one action that he has shown today, that he's quite willing. And we have said as parliamentarians in Scopa, you find us working, and we had gone ourselves to go and investigate what is happening in Treasury, and we are going to take action. Those ministers, former ministers, whatever you call them, they must come and explain the story to Parliament. And this type of information, as it continues coming up, will come back to Parliament. and we'll be able to take action against them.
All right, just before we wrap up, we also take a look at why this entire project is crucial and what was the need to renegotiate with government's top 100 suppliers, their contracts and the discrepancies that still exist due to the failure of this project. Take a look.
Thank you. Let's take a look at why the project was so crucial. Well, the value of government's top 100 suppliers over the last 3 years totaled 53 billion rands. Most of the top 100 suppliers' contracts are multi-year contracts. The big discrepancies in contracts negotiated with the different government departments for the same commodity. The cost variations are way above a reasonable market rate. The 100 Suppliers project was to normalize provisions in master agreements and reduce costs wherever possible. But the project to review and renegotiate contracts with the top 100 suppliers became restricted to just 22 suppliers. It's back to you.
Mr. Sheikh Amim, just your response in that this was a project initiated by former Finance Praveen Gordhan, saying that this will help in streamlining and saving government money and taxpayers' monies at that. We've seen now that it clearly has failed, and especially because there was a whole office set up, not only the integrated financial project system, there's also this one looking at the top 100 companies. What is your view and where things could have gone wrong?
You know, I think first of all we must ask ourselves, because were we sincere about what the intention, it appears to be good, but one needs to ask whether we are sincere about what we wanted to actually achieve. The fact that we only went for 22 out of the 100 companies, in my view, it is a deliberate act. It was done. They only wanted to deal with the 22 companies and forget about the rest. The third thing is this: who says that the former minister and the DGs do not, and including the chief procurement officer, do not have an influence today, currently, in the department as to what they're investigating, what they're doing, what they're reporting to us, what they're disclosing to us? So clearly, in my view, I can tell you from what I can see is there is some interference in any event in this process, and unless you have an inquiry, and I agree with my colleagues then, if the minister institutes an inquiry, we'll probably be able to uncover that. But the issue of the 100 companies, but clearly what you can see there is this: it is not in the interest of the black majority of the people in this country, the small businesses, the BEEs. Clearly it was not done. So for me, I'm not certain that while the intention might have been good, whether we clearly wanted to achieve that or not, or were we just trying to divert attention, because a lot of noise has been made repeatedly that the transformation is just not taking place timeously, that it's 23 years down the line, very little is happening. So I'm not sure whether we were actually being sincere about this or not. But I think what we must do is this: have this inquiry, and I agree that all departments, the appropriation, the SCOPA, the parliament must come to the effect and do what is necessary. And I think we need a post-mortem into Treasury itself, because if this is what you've uncovered, like I've said, there's a hell of a lot more that is going on. Like my colleague is saying there, maybe we need to get to the bottom of it. And I'm quite convinced that with Minister Gigaba there right now, I think he is going to take the right decision, and he's going to do what is necessary to try and bring Treasury and ensure that Treasury complies and don't behave like the big brother that they behave, like they are untouchable and arrogant, So I think that is going to actually happen. But clearly for me, I don't believe that they have done justice. I don't believe that Treasury at this point in time, and those that are responsible, including Mr. Human, I don't really believe he's well capacitated to be able to do this. And I think the next question that arises, if he's been part and parcel of that process, should he be holding the position of the Chief Procurement Officer now or not? I think that's another question that we need to ask.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed Sheikh Imam, NFP Member of Parliament. Just very briefly, closing comments. We'll start with you, Mr. Boy, that if there is a designated department that looks at procurement and you have the whole, skills and expertise, why then do we have these discrepancies? And do you think that this audit report, draft report, needs to be made public?
What Honorable, I use Honorable Kanyao have said is, when you make small business companies not to benefit, Role of government, I mean, policies are there. They've been made and was prescribed. But all of us, on the eve of the elections, this procurement centralization came in, and a lot of small black business companies were kicked out, and the African National Congress was on the verge of losing elections. That's how you put the dotting lines together, that there was a political intention, and when we looked at that political intention, the consequences that we lost Gauteng because of those particular reasons, that black business that is around started to say, how can we trust this government? And that was the purpose of doing this thing. Then that's how you interpret it. There's no other way. And that's why it's important for us who are back in Parliament and sit in the different institutions. We need to put our foot down and get results. Because we can't, if we want still to be in government in the coming years, we need to make sure that our people benefit. And it can be on the expense of government. And people are deployed in Parliament. You don't see them implementing what has been decided by the organization itself. And that's where your biggest problem is. And that's why Malusi and everybody that is there today, we say, put your foot down, because there's no way we can allow ourselves to face this type of challenge.
Honorable Boy, thank you so much for your time. And Honorable Kalni House, Honorable Adil Chabelem, Honorable Cecilia Russell, Special Projects Editor, and of course, Honorable Sheikha Imam from the NFP as the Member of Parliament. You at home, we appreciate and value your time. We'll take a quick ad break. We'll see you shortly.